You've heard that we're part of the least developed countries group, but there are a whole lot of different negotiating groups within that group. So what do we have in the definitions? Just a straight definition. In some cases, countries are called states, which means that's the name of the country. They can be a party. A party is a country that has ratified an agreement. In the Biodiversity Convention, they call them contracting parties. And then you have non-parties, who are countries who have not ratified an agreement. So in this situation, the United States is a non-party to the Kyoto Protocol. And you may see that they'll have different coloured nameplates. Sometimes the nameplates are white with black writing, and then the non-parties it's black with white writing, just to differentiate the two. Non-parties can attend meetings of agreements. So the United States comes along to the meetings of the Kyoto Protocol and makes interventions if it thinks there are issues being discussed that affect its national interest. But it can't be part of any final decision because it's not a party. So there are all sorts of regional groups that make up the negotiation processes. While we have groups, each country, each party has the right to speak and present its own country's viewpoint. You cannot deny that fact, that as a party to an agreement, you have the right. But usually, you know, remember when we're talking about informal groups and contact groups, when we get down to those small rooms, it's usually the spokespeople for different regional groups are the ones that the chair listens to, not individual countries. So this is the crucial aspect of being part of some sort of group, is that when you get down to the real hard negotiations, it's usually only the representatives of groups that are listened to. And I'll give you an example of that in the next presentation I want to give. So what are some of the groups? We've got firstly the European Community and its member states, or the European Union. There are currently 27 countries, members of the European Community and its member states. Croatia will become the 28th one in next year. So it is serviced by the European Commission, and sometimes the climate change negotiations, the European Commission will speak on behalf of the European Union. It's recognised as a collective group in the Climate Convention. There's specific wording in the Climate Convention that allows for economic units of countries or groups of countries to be represented. So the European Union is represented as a collective group, as a party, and then each of the members are also recognised as a party. So they've got a sort of a double role in the climate change negotiations. Then we have the Group of 77 in China. Why is it called Group of 77 when there are now 132 countries? It originally was formed in 1964 as part of an UNCTAD agreement, which is the UN Convention on Trade and Development, and there were 77 developing countries formed a negotiating group on this trade agreement. So that's where it came about, and the membership has now expanded. Currently, Algeria is the chair of the group, and if you follow this process for quite a period of time, you'll find that mostly the G77 in China has been chaired by OPEC groups, oil-producing groups, for most of the time. Why is that? Well, clearly they, in particular in climate change negotiations, they have a lot of interest in that area, but it's also quite expensive to coordinate the G77 in China. And it's not just climate change, it's all the different processes that go on within the UN. Algeria will be the spokesperson for the G77. So that's for the UN General Assembly, for the Rio +20, all these things are being coordinated by one country. There are a few Pacific Island countries that are not members of the G77. and Tuvalu is one of those. Kiribati is another. Why isn't Tuvalu a member of the G77? Well, if you remember the presentation I gave earlier, we only became a member of the UN in 2000, and so far we have not taken a decision to be members of G77 in China. And there are obviously advantages and disadvantages in that. Advantages are that we get to speak on our own and don't have to be part of a much bigger group, which includes all the oil-producing countries. The disadvantage in that is that as an individual country, we don't get to be heard as much, and we don't have the same sort of voice that a country within the G77 may have. Within the climate change negotiations, there's another group called the Umbrella Group. This is a group of developed countries who form a loose coalition. And it's Australia, Canada, Iceland, Japan, New Zealand, Norway, Russian Federation, Ukraine and the United States. This is the sort of bizarre part of the sort of UN process, is that the Umbrella Group is only a loose coalition. They're certainly not like the G77. They don't have to have a consensus viewpoint. In fact, you'll see often that these countries will speak on their own behalf. So they're not bound by having a sort of common position. They will sometimes present a common position, but they don't seem to be bound by that. And while one country speaks on behalf of 134 countries in the G77, the Umbrella Group, even small countries like New Zealand, get to be able to speak on their own behalf, even towards the end of negotiations. And this is what I consider to be part of the unfair process in the negotiations, is the amount of authority or power that the Umbrella Group have in the negotiation process. Sometimes the more moderate countries have different positions. Certainly New Zealand, Norway and Iceland have aligned more closely sometimes with the European Union than they have with the Umbrella Group on some negotiations. Then you have what's called the Environmental Integrity Group, which I call the leftovers. If you add up all the European Union and all the Umbrella Group, what's left over, they felt they were being left out of the negotiations, so they call themselves the Environmental Integrity Group. So it's an odd mix of countries: Switzerland, South Korea, Mexico, Monaco and Liechtenstein. And so very, very odd sort of group of countries, but they sometimes speak as a collective group. Least developed countries, we all cheer. Currently 48, 33 African, 14 Asia Pacific and 1 Caribbean. You know, based on sort of the criteria that ECOSOC uses for LDC status, Tuvalu has been recommended for graduation. You have another group, the Alliance of Small Island States, 43 countries. Most of them are island countries. There are 3 mainland Latin American countries. That's Suriname, Guyana and Belize. And they sort of joined AOSIS at the beginning in sort of solidarity with the small island states because they were low-lying countries. And of course we have amongst our group a rather well-off country, Singapore, which creates some difficulties for AOSIS from time to time, seeing they have the 5th highest GDP per capita in the world. It's hard to see them as a sort of developing country. So that makes things a bit difficult for us from time to time. Swaziland is a spokesperson for the African group. Then you have another one, the Organisation of Petroleum Exporting Countries, a very prominent group in the climate change negotiations, as you can imagine, because of their economic interests in oil exports, and think that actions to deal with climate change will affect their economic development. We are seeing some changes, and of course the Doha meeting will be interesting to see how they play their role in this process. but certainly some of these countries, certainly the United Arab Emirates, are developing a lot of renewable energy technologies, and some of the leaders in thermal energy power from UAE. So solar thermal power is they're looking, you know, and of course Venezuela is an interesting country and presents some interesting positions. That's a very diplomatic way of saying that sometimes their ideas are pretty crazy. But then we have what's called the basic group, which is India, Brazil, South Africa and China. And this as a group has become much more prominent in recent times as a group. They were certainly very prominent in Copenhagen in the negotiation process. What we've seen recently, which came out of the Copenhagen meeting, was a new group was formed, which they call themselves the Middle Ground Reasonable Group or something. What's the term they use? Sort of a middle ground group. And it's got an interesting mix of countries. So it's got, I've underlined the LDCs in the group. So it's got, well, the developed countries have got Australia, France, Germany, Netherlands, Norway, UK. So they're trying to present themselves as the sort of middle path, the sort of path of the negotiations. From my experience of dealing with that group, I have my reservations about that group as being a middle path. I think they're reducing the significance of the climate change negotiations. They're dumbing it down, I guess, if you want to put it in sort of that sort of language. And so, within the context of our discussions as a group of LDCs, we see that there are LDCs part of that. And that's moulding their perceptions and their engagement in the process. So we have to be mindful of that fact. Particularly Ethiopia and Malawi have been quite significant in their engagement with the Cartagena group. Why is it called Cartagena? Their first official meeting was held in the city of Cartagena in Colombia. So that's where the name comes from. There are other groups within the climate change negotiations. There's the ALBA group, which is, ALBA is an acronym for a Spanish word which is basically the Bolivian Alliance of the Peoples of Our Americas, which is a sort of a grouping of what I guess you call sort of left-wing governments within Latin America. So it's Venezuela, Bolivia, Cuba, Ecuador and Nicaragua are part of that, and they're presenting positions on behalf of that group. You've got the Arab group speak as well. So some of those countries are a member of the African group, but they also have positions presented by the Arab group. Recent problems with that within that group. Some of the chairing is so that's. You have what's called highly vulnerable countries. This is interesting. You can see we've got highly vulnerable countries and the vulnerable countries group. So who's who? Who are these highly vulnerable? And it's interesting to note that you know, as we progressed in the negotiations on adaptation issues, the Adaptation Fund and the Least Developed Countries Fund, there are a group of countries who felt that they'd missed out in the process. So if you look at all these small island states, in the negotiations we came out of the Bali Action Plan, it notes particularly the vulnerable countries that are small island states, least developed countries, and countries in Africa that suffer from drought and desertification. So, if you look at all those countries who's left in the sort of developing countries, and they form themselves as calling themselves the highly vulnerable countries. And it's predominantly Costa Rica, Colombia, and a couple of other Latin American countries who meet as the highly vulnerable countries. So they're trying to position themselves to get access to this funding through the Adaptation Fund. So they represent a challenge to us in defining who is the most vulnerable of the countries. So they meet as a group. SICA is another Latin American group, Central American group of countries. And then you have this vulnerable countries group, which is originally formed by Maldives. And I from what I can gather...
That is Climate Vulnerable Forum, I think.
Yes, but they sort of have different names, but I think they call it the Vulnerable Countries Forum or the Vulnerable Country Group.
They call Climate Vulnerable Forum.
Right.
And I think the Costa Rica is organizing the in October, November.
Okay.
Meeting,
Okay.
Forum.
So this is another interesting group. The first meeting was in the Maldives, and it was a group of countries basically selected by the International Institute for Environment Development. They sort of pulled that group together, IIED, and convinced the Maldives to host the first meeting with funding from UK DFID. And we were invited to attend that meeting, and I advised the Tuvalu government not to go, because I didn't think it represented the truly vulnerable countries. You know, it was an odd mix of countries, more or less sort of friends of the IIED. It included Kenya and some other countries who weren't as vulnerable as we were. And I thought it was diminishing our vulnerability by being part of that group.
My query is why all the groups keeps on coming every year. We, in the climate change negotiation process, in the protocol, in the convention, why they are allowed to participate, have a say like this? Because there must be some criteria that the groups should represent some particular, say, vulnerability, or in terms of climate change, or in terms of adaptation.
Within the sort of general rules of the UN, any gathering of countries can name themselves as a group and speak on behalf of that group.
This makes negotiation much complicated.
It
Just
does.
like the banking system,
yes,
and the legal system, so it gets complicated every year. So
it's getting
why
more...
we are making our lives so complicated?
Yes,
so
it's
why UN is not overseeing on this issue? It's too...
And particularly when we've got sort of LDCs sort of in different groups, you know, it makes it complicated to ensure that we've got some common positions.
And we are seeing LDC countries in many different groups, so
I have a follow-up question. I want to ask these things, as my friend already asked. If we, how the evolution of these groups are coming up, when you see in the time frame, and emergence of the new agendas or new kind of, politics or policies, can you just relate those emergence of those groups?
Yes. Okay, well, these groups have sort of arisen when on particular agenda items. Traditionally, LDCs are formally recognised under Article 4.9 of the Convention, so they're formally recognised as a group. And you can see that Alliance of Small Island States has been a coalition of countries right from the early times. And as agendas develop, countries are positioning themselves. So the Coalition of Rainforest Nations formed to push the agenda of REDD plus issues. So that they've got that agenda. And then as we develop the Adaptation Fund and the Adaptation Committee, there are countries who think that they've missed out on getting funding. So there you start to see the highly vulnerable countries and the vulnerable countries group or forum countries. So it depends on the agenda.
COP20 is going to be held on that reason, and where we also have a the COP president also have some kind of major influencing role to
Yes.
influence the decision. So, how you see about those?
Yeah, this is always a challenge, you know, because it is worked on this 5 regions rotation, but WEOG also includes European countries. So who knows who will host that COP20? Maybe
I
it'll
think
be
France is hosting the COP.
European. It might be European.
12, 13,
COP19 is in France. That means it is Eastern European state.
2015.
Yes,
2015 in France.
they haven't decided, I guess, because
I
the
think
next
I have seen in one.
maybe that could be.
Okay.
Yeah, the group recognized by UN and the group which is recognized by UNFCCC, like all those groups which we just said. So what is the difference? I mean, this is also UN, and
Yes.
those are also the UNFCCC.
Yes. The 5 UN recognised groups are basically they only meet to elect representatives on various bodies. So that's the Bureau, you know, the Adaptation Committee, those sorts of things. They meet and elect representatives for those groups. All right. So that's. But as a negotiating group, it's the other groups that represent the positions of countries.
And the Northern American and Southern Latin American and countries did not see in these groups.
The Latin Americans are part of GRULAC,
And North America.
North America is part of WEOG, Western European and others. There's a non-government organisation, IPOs, Indigenous Peoples Organisations, RINGOs,
Research is
yes, research institutions, non-government, and BINGOs, business.
Yes, Youngos.
yes, there is.
Yes, there's youngos, there's youngos as well. So you have various sort of roles of NGOs in this process, and I put these pictures up here. You've got the troublemakers down here. No, well, you know, part of the role of NGOs is to highlight issues. You know, a very important issue, you know, is to highlight the significant issues. So there are NGOs involved with sort of protests outside the meeting. So this was one that happened in Bangkok recently. You have NGOs who are assist in countries. So these 3 women are from the IIED that have supported the Gambia as LDCs. Then you have the women's group here who present you know, important gender issues within the climate change negotiations. This gentleman represents the Marshall Islands in negotiations, who comes from an NGO called Independent Diplomat, which is a sort of US-based NGO, but he's on the Marshall Islands delegation. He used to be an official with the Australian Foreign Affairs. And I remember going to a Law of the Sea meeting with him and having a battle with him. Next time he's a member of he comes along as the Marshall Islands delegate. So I'm not sure whether he's... I won't say any more. But, and then there are other observers, intergovernmental organisations and UN institutions. This is Taka from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And then, of course, you've got the media, who also play a very important role, and we should never forget the important role that the media has. And we're now seeing a lot more people working as bloggers, you know, putting up information on the internet as a form of communications. And so here we've got the story that came out of Bangkok. We also get reporting services that occur, you know, take daily records of the meeting as well. So we've got Earth Negotiations Bulletin and the Third World Network News as well. Plus we get commentary by NGOs in the ECO. Groups. So if you're confused, welcome. It gets very confusing, and you know, you're seeing, you know, some of our member countries sort of joining these other groups.
Finally, way forward चाहिँ अब LDC को ग्रुपलाई के हुन सक्छ भन्ने कुरामा प्रेजेन्ट गर्छ। What are LDCs भन्दाखेरि यसमा तीनवटा इकोसोकले बनाएको तीनवटा क्राइटेरियाको आधारमा डिफाइन गरिन्छ LDC। यो तीनवटा क्राइटेरिया 1971 मा डेभलप भएको रहेछ। सबभन्दा पहिलो क्राइटेरिया भनेको लो इन्कम, इन्कम चाहिँ पर क्यापिटा GDP चाहिँ $1000 भन्दा कम हुनुपर्ने रहेछ। अर्को ह्युमन विकनेस क्राइटेरियन भन्ने रहेछ। यो चाहिँ अगमेन्टेड फिजिकल क्वालिटी अफ लाइफ इन्डेक्स APQLI नामको एक्रोनिम। यसको आधारमा चारवटा न्युट्रिसन, हेल्थ, एजुकेसन र एडल्ट लिटरेसी इन्डिकेटर्सको आधारमा यो इन्डेक्स बनाइन्छ। यो पनि विक हुनु पर्यो। र इकोनोमिक भल्नरेबिलिटी क्राइटेरियन, यसमा चाहिँ विशेष गरी एग्रिकल्चर प्रोडक्सन इन्स्टेबल हुने देशहरू, त्यसपछि एक्सपोर्ट अफ गुड्स एन्ड सर्भिसेस इन्स्टेबल हुने र इकोनोमिक स्मलनेस, इकोनोमी नै एकदम सानो स्केलको हुने। तर कोही मान्छे कोही देश चाहिँ के छ भनेदेखि पर क्यापिटा इन्कम हाई भए तापनि यो दुईवटा तलको दुईवटा क्राइटेरियाले गर्दाखेरि LDCमा परेको छ। जस्तै अघि इक्वेटोरियल गिनीको पर क्यापिटा इन्कम धेरै हाई छ, तर पनि LDC परिरहेको छ। अब मलाई लाग्छ 2012 नहुनु 13-14 मा चाहिँ उनीहरू अपग्रेड हुन्छ। यो चाहिँ LDCहरूको डिस्ट्रिब्युसनको म्याप हो। मैले गुगलमा खोजेँ LDC को रिसेन्ट म्याप, तर यसमा 5-6 वर्ष मैले देखेँ। मालदिभ चाहिँ अझै पनि यसमा देखाएको छ। 11 मा चाहिँ अपग्रेड भइसकेको छ मालदिभ, स्टिल त्यसमा मालदिभ देखेको छ। मेरो फ्युचर प्रेजेन्टेसनमा सायद यसलाई फोटोसप गरेर मालदिभ सराउन्ड गर्ने हुन्छ त्यो गर्न भ्याइन्छ। र वी आर 48 countries in the LDC bracket, 33 in Africa, 14 in Asia Pacific, and 1 in America, right? Which is the one in America? Haiti. Haiti. Okay, very good. Haiti. Haiti. Okay. अब यसको कमन फिचर्सहरू हेर्दाखेरि यिनीहरू सबै हाइली भल्नरेबल टु क्लाइमेट चेन्ज इम्प्याक्ट्स, त्यो पनि रहनु परेन। यिनीहरू सबैको नेग्लिजिबल हिस्टोरिकल कन्ट्रिब्युसन टु ग्रिन हाउस ग्यास इमिसन र अहिले प्रेजेन्ट कन्डिसनमा पनि नेग्लिजिबल कन्ट्रिब्युसन छ। जियोग्राफिकल ह्यान्डिक्याप्स, स्टीप माउन्टेन्स, लो लाइङ कोस्टल एरियाजहरू, हाई प्रोपोर्सन अफ पोर एन्ड डिसएडभान्टेज ग्रुप डिपेन्डेन्ट अन ल्यान्ड एन्ड फरेस्ट फर देयर लाइभलीहुड्स। यिनीहरूको इन्स्टिट्युसन चाहिँ साह्रै विक। कारण चाहिँ पोलिटिकल ट्रान्जिसनमा धेरै कन्ट्रिजहरू भएको कारणले पनि इन्स्टिट्युसन्सहरू विक भएका छन्। र यी सबै कारणले गर्दाखेरि लो एडाप्टेसन क्यापासिटी। अब LDCहरूको लागि UNFCCC अन्तर्गत के स्पेसल अरेन्जमेन्ट्सहरू छन् त भन्दाखेरि सबभन्दा पहिला त आर्टिकल 4.9 चाहिँ LDC को लागि स्पेसल व्यवस्था गर्नुपर्छ भने अहिले भर्खर सरको प्रेजेन्टेसनमा आएको कुरा। यो हामी LDC को प्रेजेन्टेसन मिटिङहरुमा 4.9 भनेर हामी सधैँ नै हरेक मिटिङमा जस्तो यो 4.9 को कुरा आउँछ। अर्को यो COP7 को प्याकेज अफ डिसिजन्सको कुरा अघि प्रोफेसरले पनि गर्नुभयो। COP7 बाट निस्केको एउटा LDC फन्ड, LDC वर्क प्रोग्राम, यो वर्क प्रोग्राम अन्तर्गत नापा यो सेक्रेटेरिएट, क्लाइमेट चेन्ज सेक्रेटेरिएटलाई स्ट्रेन्थन गर्ने कुरा, नेगोसिएसनको बारेमा ट्रेनिङ दिने कुरा, पब्लिक अवेरनेस, development and transfer of technology like there is a lot of vision, and strengthening the capacity of hydromet services. And the LDC work program in the part of it. This was the package of decision on the leg. LDC expert group. यसको अहिले चेयर टुवालो के अरे भाइस चेयर नेपालले छ हैन, टुवालो भन्नुपर्छ। र यसले चाहिँ नापाको इम्प्लिमेन्टेसन गर्न प्रिपेयर गर्न त लगभग सबै देशको सिद्धिसक्यो, म्यानमारको पनि सिद्धियो, बाँकी एउटा बाँकी थियो। र इम्प्लिमेन्ट गर्नको लागि पनि अब नापाको रोल रहन्छ र केही समयमा अब नापमा चाहिँ यसको रोल अझै स्ट्रङ हुँदै जान्छ। LDC ग्रुपको चाहिँ एम, दुईवटा मुख्य एम छ। एउटा चाहिँ टु डिमान्ड द्याट वेल्दियर कन्ट्रिज एक्ट इन अकर्डेन्स विथ देयर रेस्पोन्सिबिलिटी for creating the problem and their capability for addressing it. Their countryलाई प्रेसर हाल्ने र to play leadership role in global efforts to prevent dangerous climate change. अब dangerous भन्ने कुरा फेरि यो चाहिँ छलफलको चाहिँ विषय रहन्छ जहिले कतिलाई डेन्जरस भन्ने कतिलाई नभन्ने। अहिलेको करेन्ट चेयर गाम्बिया हो, अफिसियली उनीहरूले द गाम्बिया पनि लेख्यो। पा उस्मान जार्जु यसको अहिले चेयर हुनुहुन्छ र इन्कमिङ चेयर चाहिँ नेपाल 2013-14 को लागि। यो चाहिँ साइक्लिक अर्डरमा हुन्छ, अफ्रिकापछि अहिले एसियाको टर्न आएको, अफ्रिकाको दुईचोटि आउँछ त्यसपछि एसिया पेसिफिक। क्लाइमेट एनालिटिक्स भन्ने अर्को एउटा एनजिओ छ, यसले पनि सिडिकेबाट सपोर्ट पाएको छ भन्ने सपोर्ट, यसले पनि टेक्निकल सपोर्ट गर्छ एलडिसी चेयरलाई। र एउटा युरोपमा एउटा युरोपियन क्यापेसिटी बिल्डिङ इन्स्टिट्युट भन्ने रहेछ, यसले पनि क्यापेसिटी बिल्डिङ गर्नको लागि एलडिसी चेयरलाई सपोर्ट गर्ने कोअर्डिनेसन टिमको मेम्बरहरूलाई क्यापेसिटी बिल्ड गर्ने सहयोग पुऱ्याएको रहेछ। र लिगल सपोर्ट चाहिँ एलआरआई लिगल रेस्पोन्स युनिट भन्ने लन्डन बेस्ड एउटा लयर्सहरूको इन्टरनेसनल लयर्सहरूको संस्था छ। यसले चाहिँ रियल टाइम लिगल एडभाइस पनि दिने र अरू चाहेको बेलामा वर्षभरि सधैँ चाहिँ लिगल सपोर्ट चाहिँ यसले प्रोभाइड गर्छ। त्यस कारण एलडिसी ग्रुप चेयर एक्लैले गर्न पनि सक्दैन र चेयरको टिमलाई सपोर्ट गर्ने अरू विभिन्न एनजिओ र विभिन्न संस्थाहरू कार्यरत छन्। अब एलडिसी ग्रुपले के गर्छ त भन्दाखेरि यो प्रिपेरेटरी मिटिङ्स बिफोर कप र इन्टरसेसनल मिटिङ्सहरू हुनुभन्दा अगाडि, फर्मल इन्फर्मल मिटिङ हुनुभन्दा अगाडि प्रिपेरेटरी मिटिङ्सहरूमा 2 दिन जति एलडिसीको सुरुमा नै यो प्रिपेरेटरी एलडिसीको मिटिङ्सहरू हुन्छ। त्यसपछि यो मिटिङ्सहरू कप र इन्टरसेसनल मिटिङको कोअर्डिनेसन मिटिङ्स भनेर यहाँ दिउँसो लन्च टाइममा 1 देखि 2, त्यसै कारणले लन्च खान चाहिँ यो एलडिसी ग्रुपमा एक्टिभली कोअर्डिनेसनमा लाग्ने मान्छेहरूलाई चाहिँ लन्च टाइम भन्ने नै हुँदैन। कोही बेलामा अघि 10 मिनट या 10 minutes to have lunch, sometimes we don't even have lunch. So we make it a point that we eat a big breakfast in the morning. त्यस कारणले अनि त्यसपछि फेरि इभिनिङमा हुन्छ, दिनभरिको छलफल हो चाहिँ के भयो भनेर त्यसलाई रिक्याप गर्नको लागि रिभ्यू गर्नको लागि इभिनिङमा कति 7 to 8 होइन कि 8 to 9 7 to 8 मा फेरि कोअर्डिनेसन मिटिङ हुन्छ। त्यसै कारणले यो नाइटमेयर चाहिँ अब कन्टिन्यू हुनेवाला छ, किनभने अहिलेसम्म त पार्टिसिपेट मात्रै भएको हिसाबले अब त्यो सबै म्यानेज गर्नु पऱ्यो, फेसिलिटेट गर्नु पऱ्यो भनेपछि द नाइटमेयरिस डेज आर अहेड। त्यसपछि स्ट्राटेजी मिटिङ्सहरू हुन्छ एलडिसी ग्रुपभित्र पनि। अब स्ट्राटेजी विभिन्न नेगोसिएसन स्ट्रिममा के स्ट्राटेजी बनाउने हो, गिभ एन्ड टेक कति, रेड लाइन के हो हाम्रो होइन भन्ने कुराहरू छलफल गर्नुको लागि स्ट्राटेजी मिटिङ्सहरू। त्यसको साथसाथै बाइल्याटरल सिरिज अफ बाइल्याटरल्स, कहिले युसँग, कहिले अस्ट्रेलियासँग छुट्टै, कहिले जापानसँग, कहिले डिनरमा बोलाएको हुन्छ। भन्दाखेरि यो सबै बाइल्याटरल मिटिङ्सहरू पनि साथसाथै लानुपर्ने हुन्छ। र कहिलेकाहीँ एलडिसी चेयरले इम्पोर्टेन्ट सबमिसन गर्ने बेलामा पनि यो बाइल्याटरल मिटिङसँग क्लास हुने भएको हुनाले यो आफ्नो टिमलाई चाहिँ छर्नुपर्ने हुन्छ, कसैलाई बाइल्याटरल पठाउने र कसैलाई चाहिँ सबमिसन गर्ने। र इम्पोर्टेन्ट यो सेक्रेटेरिएटसँग कोअर्डिनेसन गर्ने काम चाहिँ एकदम इम्पोर्टेन्ट हुँदो रहेछ। अब रुम बुकिङ गर्नेदेखि लिएर यो सबभन्दा इम्पोर्टेन्ट चाहिँ यो रुम बुकिङ हुँदो रहेछ, स्पेस लिमिटेड हुने। अनि त्यसपछि टाइम क्लास भन्ने विभिन्न ग्रुपहरू, अब यो ग्रुपको सङ्ख्याहरू झन् बढिरहेको छ, उनीहरूले पनि आफ्नो मिटिङ गर्नको लागि, बाइल्याटरल गर्नको लागि, स्ट्राटेजी मिटिङ गर्नको लागि रुमहरू बुक गर्ने भएको हुनाले यो सेक्रेटेरिएटसँग क्लोजली कोअर्डिनेट गरिकन अलिक प्लानिङ पनि अलिक अगाडि नै गरिकन त्यो रुमहरू बुक गर्नुपर्ने रहेछ। र कहिलेकाहीँ त्यहाँ रुम नपाएर बाहिर होटेलमा पनि गर्नुपर्ने हुँदो रहेछ कहिले मिटिङ्सहरू, र त्यसको लागि कस्ट पर्ने पर्थ्यो। त्यसबाहेक एलडिसी ग्रुपले आफ्नो रिप्रेजेन्टेन्टहरू यो ग्रिन क्लाइमेट फन्ड, एडभर्टाइजमेन्ट कमिटी र त्यस्तै अरू संस्थाहरू पठाउनु पर्ने हुन्छ। ग्रिन क्लाइमेट फन्डमा अहिले एलडिसीको तर्फबाट जाम्बिया र बङ्गलादेश 2 जनालाई हामीले पठाएका छौँ। र एडप्टेसन कमिटीमा सुमाया सुडान होइन सुडान। अब की पोजिसन्स यसमा चाहिँ यो अघि मैले भने रिसेन्टली गरेको सबमिसनको आधारमा मैले तयार गरेको इन्क्रिज द लेभल अफ एमिसन टु लिमिट वार्मिङ बिलो 1.5 डिग्रिज। कोही सबमिसन्समा 1.5 डिग्रिज अर 2 डिग्रिज पनि भन्ने गरिएको छ, तर हामी चाहिँ स्टिक हुँदाखेरि नेगोसिएसन गर्दाखेरि 1.5 डिग्रिज इन द लङ रन साइन्सले पनि यही भनेको हुनाले हामी यसमा स्टिक भएको छ। अनि हाम्रो सबमिसन्समा जहिले पनि डेभलप कन्ट्री पार्टिज आर अर्ज टु टेक द लिड इन मिटिगेसन एक्सन्स। We also encourage the developing countries to implement robust voluntary mitigation actions. र अब चाहिँ यो AWG LCA को चाहिँ सक्सेसफुल कन्क्लुजन हुनुपर्छ भन्ने पनि हाम्रो माग छ, तर सक्सेसफुल कन्क्लुजनभित्र धेरै शर्तहरू छ। त्यसै AWLCA मा बाँकी रहेको कामहरू सबैलाई अहिले नयाँ आएको ADB मा डम्प गर्ने अथवा SBI र साफ्टामा लगेर डम्प गर्ने त्यो खेल पनि हुँदैछ। त्यसको चाहिँ हामी सबको विरोध छ। त्यसको सक्सेसफुल कम्प्लिसन हुनुपर्छ भन्ने मान्यता छ। अब ग्रिन क्लाइमेट फन्डमा चाहिँ प्लेजेसहरू त आएको छ, तर यसलाई अझै पनि स्केल अप गर्नुपर्छ, पैसा पुग्दैन भन्ने कुरा हाम्रो पोजिसन हो। एडप्टेसन फन्डिङको लागि चाहिँ धेरै नै प्रायोरिटी दिनुपर्छ भन्ने हाम्रो अर्को एउटा स्ट्रङ पोजिसन। त्यसै बाहेक यो बायोलेटरल नेगोसिएसन अरू ग्रुपहरूलाई चाहिँ प्रेसर हाल्नको लागि पनि हामीले चाहिँ यो बायोलेटरल नेगोसिएसन्स गर्नै पर्ने हुन्छ। त्यसलाई चाहिँ सशक्त रूपमा अगाडि बढाउनुपर्छ। त्यसदेखि बाहेक एडभोकेसी र कम्युनिकेसन। अहिले LDC ग्रुपको यो वेब आफ्नै डेडिकेटेड वेब पेज छ, त्यसपछि ट्विटरमा कुराहरू आउँछ, प्रेसमा इन्टरभ्यूहरू हुन्छ, विभिन्न मिटिङहरूमा LDC चेयर प्लस अरू कोअर्डिनेसन कमिटीका मान्छेहरूले भाग लिन्छ। हाम्रो भिजिबिलिटी चाहिँ अहिले यो केही 2-3 वर्षमा अलिक बढी नै भएको देखिन्छ र यसबाट LDC ग्रुपको जुन पोजिसनहरू विभिन्न पार्टिजहरूलाई र विभिन्न ग्रुपहरूलाई कम्युनिकेट भएको पनि छ र यसलाई अझ सशक्त बनाएर पनि लानुपर्ने छ। र हाम्रो भिजन पाउसमा अहिलेको करेन्ट चेयर र म चाहिँ ब्याङ्कको 2 हप्ताको यो इन्फर्मल मिटिङको बेलामा लगभग हामी राति सुत्ने बेलामा चाहिँ हामी छुट्टै हुन्थ्यौँ होला। ब्रेकफास्ट खाएर थियो, आइसकेपछि 9 to लगभग 8सम्म चाहिँ हामी मोरलेस सँगसँगै काम गरेको हुनाले हामीले चाहिँ एउटा भिजन के डेभलप गरेको छ भनेदेखि यो LDC ग्रुपलाई चाहिँ अब नट अ ग्रुप द्याट फलोज बट अ ग्रुप द्याट लिड्स क्लाइमेट चेन्ज नेगोसिएसनमा अनि त्यो भिजन राखेर अगाडि बढ्नुपर्छ भनेर हामी काम गर्ने विचार गर्छौँ। हस्, थ्याङ्क यू।
जो चाहिँ 2टा सेसन थियो, एउटा इनअगुरल सेसन र अर्को टेक्निकल सेसन। उद्घाटन सत्रको सुरुवात हाम्रो प्रकाश नाम्तेमा सरबाट यो कार्यक्रमको परिचयको साथसाथै यो कार्यक्रमको अब्जेक्टिभको सिलसिलामा हाम्रो क्यापासिटी चाहिँ पक्कै पनि इन्हान्स हुनुपर्छ यो पार्टिसिपेसन गरिसकेपछि भन्ने सन्देश दिइसकेपछि हाम्रो राष्ट्रिय योजना आयोगको पूर्व उपाध्यक्ष डाक्टर दिनेश चन्द्र देवकोटाज्यूको एड्रेसमा उहाँले यो क्लाइमेट चेन्ज नेगोसिएसन चाहिँ अत्यन्त महत्त्वपूर्ण अपर्च्युनिटी हो, यसलाई हामीले ग्र्याप्स गर्न सक्नुपर्छ भनेर हामीलाई एउटा उत्साहप्रद शिक्षा पनि दिनुभयो र साथसाथै हामीले क्लाइमेट डिप्लोमेसी पोलिसीको बारेमा पनि सोच्ने बेला भइसक्यो अब भनेर एउटा सन्देश दिनुभयो। र उहाँको एउटा एक्सपेक्टेसन के रह्यो भने सम्भवतः सन् 2013सम्ममा नेपाल चाहिँ अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय परिदृश्यमा भिजिबल हुनु नै पर्छ, किनभने LDC को चेयर गर्दैछ र त्यो भिजिबल बनाउनलाई हामीले गर्नुपर्ने जति पनि प्रयास छ हामीहरू गरौँ, यसैलाई मौकाको रूपमा लिउँ भनेर उहाँले हामीलाई सन्देश दिनुभएको थियो। पछि हाम्रो इन्टरनेसनल रिसोर्स पर्सन थाइले LDC चेयर हुनुको अर्थ सबै थोक मै मात्रै गर्छु भन्ने कुरो होइन, तर अरूलाई फेसिलिटेट गर्न सक्नुपर्छ, किनभने अरू देशहरूमा पनि धेरै ठुलो विज्ञताहरू छ, धेरै ज्ञानहरू छन्, त्यसलाई फेसिलिटेट गर्ने हो भनेदेखि हामीलाई सजिलो हुन्छ भन्ने सल्लाह दिनुभयो। र त्यही क्रममा हाम्रो माननीय मन्त्रीज्यूले सम्भवतः यो नेगोसिएटिङ टिमको आधार मानेर टिमको अर्थ के हो भन्ने बारेमा बडा राम्रो कुरा गर्नुभयो र फुटबलको उदाहरण दिँदै जसरी सबैको रेस्पोन्सिबिलिटी बाँडेको हुन्छ यो टिममा पनि रेस्पोन्सिबिलिटी बाँडिएर काम गर्यो भने सफलता मिल्छ भन्ने खालको मेसेज दिनुभएको थियो। र स्पेसल्ली हाम्रो इस्युहरू चाहिँ युनिक छन् किनभने हामी माउन्टेनियस कन्ट्रीहरू हौँ, माउन्टेन इकोसिस्टम र विविध कुराहरूले पनि यो एकदम युनिक छ, यो चिज हामीले बुझ्नुपर्छ भनेर सल्लाह पनि दिनुभयो। र हाम्रो सेक्रेटरीज्यू कृष्ण ग्यावाली सरले यो टिम हिजो धेरै कुरो टिमकै बारेमा भयो र उहाँले टिमलाई अझ कसरी परिभाषित गर्नुभयो भने यो मन्त्रालयको अथवा सरकारको टिम होइन, यो त यो देशको टिम हो, कन्ट्रीको टिम हो, यो इन्क्लुसिभ छ, सबैले अनरसिप लिनुपर्छ र आफ्नो आफ्नो रोल अनुसार चाहिँ काम गर्नुपर्छ, यो गहनतालाई बुझौँ, यो ग्राभिटीलाई बुझौँ भन्ने खालको सन्देश उहाँले दिनुभयो। र साथसाथै उहाँले अलिकति के पनि भन्नुभयो भने जति नै मेहनत गर्दा पनि हामीसँग इभिडेन्स बेस्ड डेटाहरू नभएको हुनाले हाम्रो इन्टरनेसनल नेगोसिएसन चाहिँ अलिकति विक भएको छ, पुष्टि गर्नलाई गाह्रो भएको छ भन्ने कुरा उहाँले गरिसकेपछि हाम्रो इनअगुरल सेसन सकियो र हामी टेक्निकल सेसनमा आएपछि पहिलो प्रेजेन्टेसन हाम्रो अन्तर्राष्ट्रिय रिसोर्स पर्सन काईले दिनुभएको थियो र यो नेगोसिएसन युएनको कन्टेक्स्टमा के हुन्छ भन्ने बारेमा अब देशै पनि 193 वटा छन्, भाषा पनि 6 वटा छ, त्यसको अर्थ यो होमोजिनिटी छैन, एकदम हेटेरोजिनियस मास हो र यो लिड गर्न चाहिँ एकदम स्किल चाहिन्छ भन्नुभयो भने एग्रिमेन्टहरू पनि विभिन्न खालका छन्, कुनैलाई नन बाइन्डिङ एग्रिमेन्ट भनिन्छ, कुनैलाई रिजोल्युसन भनिन्छ, कसैलाई लिगल्ली बाइन्डिङ ट्रिटी अथवा कन्भेन्सन भनिन्छ र एउटा र अर्काको बिचमा के फरक छ त्यो कुरो पनि थाहा पाउनु जरुरी रहेछ र उहाँले राम्रो डिफिनेसन पनि दिनुभयो। त्यस्तै गरेर ट्रिटिजहरू पनि एक किसिमको मात्रै हुँदो रहेछ, कुनै फ्रेमवर्क एग्रिमेन्ट, कुनै लिगल्ली बाइन्डिङ प्रोटोकल, आफूले केमा डिल गरिराखिएको छ भनेर स्पष्ट पहिल्यै बुझ्नुपर्ने रहेछ। अनि मिटिङ भन्ने पनि एउटा मात्रै हुँदो रहेछ, प्लेनरी मिटिङ, वर्किङ ग्रुप, कन्ट्याक्ट ग्रुप मिटिङ, इन्फर्मल ग्रुप मिटिङ, फ्रेन्ड्स अफ द चेयर र यी मध्ये सबैभन्दा महत्त्वपूर्ण इन्फर्मल ग्रुप मिटिङ हो जहाँ अलिक चिजहरू खुलेर कुरा हुन्छन् र लगभग निर्णय गर्ने लेभलमा पुगिसकेपछि मात्रै कुरो प्लेनरी सेसनमा पुग्छ भनेर पनि उहाँले हाइलाइट गर्नुभयो। अनि दोस्रो प्रस्तुता हुनुहुन्थ्यो परराष्ट्र मन्त्रालयका पूर्व सचिव मधुरमन आचार्य सर। उहाँले यो क्लाइमेट चेन्जसँग गाँसिएको पोलिटिकल नेगोसिएसनमा के कुराहरू छन् भनेर UNFCCC को कुरा, क्योटो प्रोटोकलको कुरा, कोपनहेगन एकर्ड, क्यान्कुन एग्रिमेन्ट, दरबान प्लेटफर्म फर इन्हेन्स्ड एक्सन, यी सबै कुराहरूलाई एक आपसमा कसरी गाँसिएको छ भनेर फुलको माला गाँसे जस्तै लहरै सबै कुराहरू लानुभयो र माथिका जतिसुकै कुरा भए पनि त्यहाँ थुप्रै डिसएग्रिमेन्टहरू छन्। उदाहरणको लागि यो इमिसन लिमिट कतिमा राख्ने, त्यहाँ यो लेभल अफ लिमिट कतिमा राख्ने, वार्मिङमा 1.5 मा राख्ने कि 2 डिग्रीमा राख्ने कि भन्ने बारेमा अझै एकरूपता छैन र प्रसङ्गवश नेपालले 1.5 भनेको पछि अरू कुराहरू पनि आएको कुराहरू पनि त्यहाँ हो। त्यस्तै गरी यो टाइम फर इमिसन पिक चाहिँ कतिलाई मान्ने, 2015लाई मान्ने कि 2020लाई मान्ने कि भन्ने बारेमा कुरो चलिरहेको छ र कतिपय केसहरूमा त याज सुन याज पोसिबल तुरुन्तै गरिहाल्नु